I'm Steve Kraske, and this is KCUR's Up to Date. Since 2011, the Kansas 3rd Congressional District has been a Republican bulwark. This year, though, Democrats smell an opportunity. Today, the district's sitting Congressman Kevin Yoder joins me to discuss the most recent revelations about the Trump administration, his re-election campaign, and his work in Washington. Then, a certain editorial published last week by the New York Times has thrust the use of anonymous sources into the spotlight. We'll ask the media critics if it's journalistically okay to use them and why. They'll also explain how off the record and on background really work. We'll get you up to date after this hour's news. How close is the race between four-term incumbent Congressman Kevin Yoder and Democratic upstart Sharice Davids? Pretty darn close. The nonpartisan Cook Political Report rates the showdown as a toss-up. One big issue, immigration. Yoder has backed away from a Democratic plan to make it easier for migrants fleeing domestic abuse to claim asylum in this country. Another big issue, health care and the future of the Affordable Care Act. Congressman Kevin Yoder joins me here in the studio. And Congressman, it's always good to have you. Welcome back.
Steve, great to be back in studio. Thanks for having me on the show.
This is looking to me to be your toughest race for Congress yet. Does it feel that way to you?
Well, I think anytime when you're in a midterm election and you're the party in power and you have the presidency, the House, and the Senate, it's going to be difficult on the incumbent if they're in that party. And so, each race we take very seriously, Steve. This is my fifth time running for Congress. We ran in an open race in 2010. I think I had 8 Republican primary opponents. That was a pretty tough race.
Yes, it was.
We had then ran against the incumbent spouse. That was, also a very serious race, and we had a lot of debates, and that was tough as well. We've had some easier ones, some tougher ones. We expect this will be a challenging election season, but we're very pleased with where we are. Working very hard. I would tell you, Steve, no one outworks me in a political race. We get adrenaline from it. We enjoy it. It's like Bob Dole's old thing where he could sit and talk to people all day long. He still does it. He came back a couple of years ago because he gets energy from it.
Yeah.
And so we work very hard. I go to,
That means you're an extrovert, Congressman.
Yeah, well.
That's a classic textbook definition, I think.
I get enthused by it. The crowds energize me. So we like it. That doesn't necessarily mean it's easy. I mean, but we get adrenaline from it. I would tell you, we work every corner of the district. This is a very diverse district when you have Wyandotte County, Johnson County, and Miami County, and each neighborhood sort of has different perspectives. We've got very liberal neighborhoods, very conservative, very moderate, and in some ways, Steve, it's a cross-section of America. Because if we can agree on things here in our community, then we're probably showing the rest of the country the way.
We'll get to some of the issues in just a few minutes, but let's begin with President Trump, who's been the subject of so much attention lately. The big new book out by Bob Woodward, it's out today, and the controversial and anonymous op-ed last week in the New York Times. The message from both is similar, and that is the president can't be fully trusted to run the country. And my question is, do you have full trust in President Trump to run this country right now?
Yeah, of course. I mean, I think he was democratically elected by the American people. He is the president of the United States, and we need to support him and work with him to get things done. And you contrast that by the folks on the far left who focus on resistance and obstruction, and we're focused on working with the president to solve problems.
But these are insiders, presumably from your party, who are saying this president may be unfit to hold the office.
Look, I don't get involved in the palace intrigue that drives the cable news talk shows and that drives the book sales. None of us
but
are.
This is fairly serious stuff. This is Bob Woodward with a new book who's got a sterling reputation.
I take all of those things seriously, and I think we should all be rooting for folks to work with the president. I think it's concerning if folks are saying their goal is to undermine the president, that they're quietly resisting from within. I know people would say they would be very concerned if there was a Tea Party person in the Obama administration that was saying they're quietly trying to undermine the president. That would be outrage. And so I think we've become very divided as a country. Everything has become, high stakes endeavor. Right. So everything is for playing for keeps here. My goal, Steve, is whether it's President Obama or would have been President Clinton or President Trump, is to work with them to get things done on behalf of the American people. And I work with President Obama on a lot of things. I've worked with the current president, and I've opposed the president on many things because we have to put what's right for the 3rd District and for the American people first.
Congressman, the president himself calls this act, this anonymous op-ed, treason. Single word tweet out last week. Is it treason in your view?
I don't know if I would call it treason. I think it depends what job this person has, right? If this person has a job that deals with national security or something that might affect, our safety and security of the American people, maybe. I think it depends where they are. If they're a mid-level bureaucrat, so we don't know enough about who they are or what they do. But I just think there's too much of an effort to obstruct this administration at every turn. I understand many people don't like what this administration stands for. I don't like the president's tweets many times. I don't like the style. But I do think when the president focuses on the economy, when he focuses on national security, he does have the support of the majority of the American people. I mean, look at where we are economically right now, Steve. And people will say, look, I talk to people all the time, will say, Kevin, I like what you're doing. I like where the economy is. I have concerns about the president, or I don't. People might say they don't like the president. And so he is a factor in every conversation. I completely get that.
A lot of people would say with some justification, he's our national provocateur, that he's getting as good as he's giving here and maybe provoking the country to be in this intensely divided state that maybe is more intense than it was even a few years ago.
Yeah, and if that's the case, I don't like that part of it. I do think there's a codependency here between the media and the presidency. They feed off each other. And look, that's not why I got into public service. That's not why I got into politics. My goal is to fight for the people of my community and solve problems. And so that's the tact I took, whether it was President Obama or whether it's going to be President Trump. And I would tell you, we get calls all the time from people saying they want us to impeach the president. I mean, those calls come into our office. And it was very interesting, Steve. The first 6 years that I served in this seat, President Obama was the president. We got calls every day, roughly, from people saying, need to impeach President Obama. Now we get calls every day saying you need to impeach President Trump. What I try to do is tune all of that out and focus on what are the words I'm using? What are the statements I'm making? What do my tweets say? How am I representing the principles, the values, the things that our community wants me to stand for? And that's the job that I'm set to do, and that's where I focus on and don't get caught up in these other issues.
Let me read you one paragraph from the anonymous op-ed in the Times last week, and I'm quoting here. The dilemma which the president does not fully grasp is that many of the senior officials in his own administration are working diligently from within to frustrate parts of his agenda and his worst inclinations. In a sense, I'm paraphrasing now, the administration is working against itself. Does that suggest that Congress needs to up its game when it comes to oversight of this administration?
Well, I have long argued, whether it was the last administration or this administration, that Congress should be more engaged in the oversight of the administration, that the executive branch has too much power, and that the laws ought to be enforced as written by Congress, and presidents tend to ignore that. And so, we want a country that's focused on solving problems for the American people. That's where I am. That's where the country needs to go. And there's a battle between those who, for all lack of a better word, hate the president and the president, attacking other folks. I just think all that's unproductive. I've mentioned this to the administration. I've stood up when the president has said things that I've disagreed with. Whether it was in Charlottesville or his tweet about John Lewis. So I try to lead by example here. And, I've been in your program many times with Emmanuel Cleaver.
Right.
He and I co-chair a caucus called the Civility Caucus.
Right.
And our goal is to bring civility back to politics, to get people talking to each other, listening to each other. And that's not happening enough in this country.
Congressman, I get that. I want to just try one more time on this administration, because some of this, some of the anonymous op-ed, the Woodward book, are really sort of unprecedented, at least in my experience covering politics. We're at a moment here, and I'm wondering, how concerned are you about the president when these kinds of things, with some justification and verification, are being written about him?
Well, again, I think if people are actively working to undermine the president of the United States, who was elected by the American people, and are proud of that fact, and we're heralding that fact, we've gotten to a really bad spot. And so,
or undermining him, or is the president, again, is he capable of doing the job before him?
Yes.
Okay, we're going to leave it there. Let's turn to your race against Democrat Sharice Davids, and I want to play you an ad that your campaign is running right now against Sharice Davids. Okay, we don't have it right now, but this ad concludes with three words: dishonest, dangerous, and then the words "and too radical." Is she really?
Yeah, I mean, Sharice Davids is the most radical liberal candidate that's ever been nominated for Congress in the 3rd District and possibly
One of the
in
most
history.
radical ever.
Yes.
Why?
Well, we have a history in this district, Steve, particularly on the Democratic side. They've always tried to nominate a blue dog in the mold of Dennis Moore. And now I have an opponent who says in the paper, she says I'm not a moderate. She says that Nancy Pelosi is a tremendous leader. She had said in repeated interviews that she supported either was coy about it or didn't answer the way she's trying to answer now, that she supported abolishing ICE. Mm-hmm. She said she doesn't want to abolish ICE. She says that now, but Steve, even when the Kansas City Star asked her about it the day after the election, they sent her a questionnaire and she wrote out answers. I don't even believe it was live. And one of the questions was, do you support abolishing ICE? She didn't say yes. She didn't say no. She said the movement to abolish ICE stems from a real concern amongst actions that they're taking. So she tried to play coy on it or say she supported abolishing ICE, right? I mean, if anyone wants to listen to the Millennial Project audio, I encourage you to listen to the entire thing. They ask her if she wants to abolish it, to be clear, and she says, well, I do, but I would support defunding it, which is the same thing. And only when we started calling her on that, Steve, did she decide to change her answer on that, which is fine. But the point is...
But why call her dangerous, though?
Well, because I think abolishing ICE is very dangerous. When you look at, they had 32,000 criminal arrests last year. The Homeland Security Investigations Team, HSI, they're responsible for investigating drug trafficking and sex trafficking, all these horrible crimes. They arrested over 4,000 drug traffickers and gang members. And so these are folks that make our country less safe. And the idea that we would abolish that, we would defund that, means that our families and our community is less safe. That is dangerous. That is dangerous. And Steve, I don't think the people of this district agree with that, which is why she's trying to change her position on it after holding that same position for so long. That is a very dangerous, very radical position to take. And I think it speaks to a larger left-wing movement within the Democratic Party. This is not a moment in which the Democrats are saying, let's nominate centrist candidates in the mold of Dennis Moore. Let's nominate blue dogs. They're not saying that. Dennis Moore ran as a centrist. My opponent's saying she's running as a liberal, running as a progressive. She says she's not a moderate. That's new, and we don't have a record of electing left-wing extremists here. And certainly I've had moderate people say they don't like the gubernatorial nominee, right? But for the same reason that you shouldn't like the Democratic nominee for Congress, because you have folks that many will argue are on the opposite ends of the spectrum. So I will tell you, Steve, in the fall election, I will be the centrist in this race.
Well, speaking of the gubernatorial nominee, do you support Chris Kobach for governor?
I support the entire ticket, Steve.
Okay.
Yep.
Let me turn to immigration again. Kansas Congressman Kevin Yoder is my guest. Democrats are saying you're the one who's been dangerous here because twice in recent months you've switched positions on key aspects of the immigration debate. Just a few days ago, you said you no longer support a Democratic plan to make it easier for migrants fleeing domestic abuse or gang violence to claim asylum in this country. The Star reported that this came after no less a personage than the Attorney General of the United States called your office to complain about your backing of this Democratic plan. Why did you back away from it?
Well, Steve, we never did. And I think if you read the quotes that I gave to Brian Lowry on it, the headline didn't match the quotes, which is a big challenge at the Star, which I'm sure you're aware of. But, what I explained to Brian and I've explained to multiple reporters throughout this situation is that I support people with domestic violence claims being able to make those claims in their asylum claim when they come as part of a thing that the government ought to be able to factor in.
But not automatic asylum.
Not automatic asylum if you just make the claim. I support it as being a part of a claim that you could make and that we shouldn't turn away somebody if that is their only part of a claim. We ought to consider that.
But did you or did you not back the Democratic plan?
Yeah, Steve,
if you let me
finish.
Okay.
So in committee, I said I supported that, and I supported the proposal that was brought forward in committee.
The Democratic plan.
It was brought by Democrats. That's right,
okay.
Steve, because I work across the aisle to get things done. I also supported a Democratic plan that would make sure that DACA kids can't be deported. right? I also supported a Democratic plan that would ensure that we can't separate parents from their children.
But after you
right?
after
So
you
supported
made
all
this
of those.
decision to support the plan, you received a call from Jeff Sessions.
Nope. I've never talked to Jeff Sessions
Okay, your
about it.
staff did.
They did beforehand.
Okay.
Not after. They
Not
did
after.
beforehand.
Okay.
And we supported that. There have been concerns raised that allowing this would allow a lot of fraudulent claims. And in talking to the CBP, the Customs Border Protection at the border, there have been clear concerns that this would allow millions of people potentially to make fraudulent claims. And what I have
in other words,
is,
I'm being abused back in my home country.
Don't have
Give
to
me
prove
asylum
much
to
and
this country. You don't have to
asylum.
prove anything.
right, and then they get a court
Okay.
date 5 years later. And so that was not our intent. That was not my intent. So what I said is I was going to work to fix the amendment, and that's the quote that I released a couple days after the amendment passed. I actually said that, and the Kansas City Star ran an article saying Yoder flips on the issue. So you already wrote that back in July, and I said I would work to fix it. Then 6 weeks later, I talked to Brian Lowry, your Star reporter, and I mentioned when we were talking about other things I'm working on that it's going to be difficult to get that provision all the way through the process.
Right.
I'm the chairman of the committee. It's not in the Senate version. It's in the House version, but it's not supported by the administration, and that it's probably going to have to go back to committee to get more work. It's probably a Judiciary Committee issue. It's probably beyond what the Appropriations Committee is able to sort out, this issue of how you stop fraudulent claims. What we need, Steve, is more judges at the border. We need the ability to deal with claims promptly so that accurate claims get dealt with and false claims get dealt with as well, and people can return to their country if they have a false claim.
What kind of evidence do you need to prove that someone is being abused back in their home country? I mean, again, you can get into
So what
murky
happens
waters
right
here
now
pretty quickly.
what happens right now is when you walk into the country, you can make sort of a prima facie argument, and then you might get a court date 5 years later to come back to make the case. People don't show up, and then the judge goes ahead and then has a hearing on the evidence and the facts. And my understanding is 80% of those cases aren't actually ever proven, or the folks don't show up. And so what we want to avoid, though, is an opportunity for more human trafficking, more illegal immigration to come into the country. And Steve, that's where I focused my time in leadership on this committee. The first thing I did when I got into this chairmanship about 3 or so months ago is I went down to the border and I personally looked at what we were dealing with in the Rio Grande Valley. We're being overrun. Drug trafficking, human trafficking, it puts our border communities at a risk. It puts our own communities at a risk. When you look at drug cartels made $64 billion last year in selling drugs in the United States, Steve, and now it's the largest cause of death for people under the age 50. I don't know about you, Steve, but that makes me mad that our government hasn't done its job to secure its borders, to protect the American people, and all that profit, it goes back down to Mexico. They had a 19% increase in murder rates this year. I'm told that 95 to 98% of the crimes in Mexico aren't even being prosecuted. And so a lot of that's being fueled, Steve, by the dollars of American people that are buying drugs that are coming across the border. And so that goes back to my opponent. When she doesn't want to secure the border, she doesn't want to enforce our immigration laws, that makes us less safe. That is dangerous. That is radical, and that is something that is not consistent with what the people of this district want to see done.
You still favor building the fence, the wall that the president
Well, I
talked
listen
about.
to the Customs Border Protection folks, and I encourage everyone to talk to them. I encourage my opponent to listen to them. They want barriers in the Rio Grande Valley sector. They want barriers in the Laredo sector. What we did in my bill was give them resources to use on their top priorities with the types of materials they want. So they're talking about 18 steel bollards, and in some places it's vehicle barriers. We have barriers on 650 out of 2,000 miles, right? I don't find many people, maybe my opponent, I don't find many people asking to take those down. Right, so most people agree that barriers work when they're combined with personnel and technology. And when you talk to the folks at the border, they tell you we need more personnel, we need more agents, we need more technology, and we need barriers to work together to secure our borders. And when we see folks trying to undermine that, fighting those barriers, fighting the new agents, right? They want to defund these agencies. That puts our communities, that puts the American people at risk. That is too radical and too dangerous. And it's something this district has never voted for before, those left-wing ideas. And that's why I think my opponent's going to have a difficult time.
Representative Kevin Yoder is my guest. Staying with immigration, Congressman, in June you said that separating migrant children from the adults who brought them across the border illegally was necessary to keep them safe from traffickers and drug cartels. It was okay then to separate kids from their parents. That was your position. About 10 days later, you shifted course after hearing from constituents back home in your district. My question, when is it ever okay to separate kids from their parents?
Well, I don't think I ever said it was okay. I think the challenge was people were violating our laws, and we couldn't put children in the adult jails that the Department of Justice was moving forward on. So we had a very tough choice to make. Either release the adults, again, for 5-year court dates down the road, or keep them jailed together, which they couldn't do under under a court settlement that doesn't allow them to do that. Or the administration was telling us they had no choice but to separate them. I had been chair of the committee for about 2 weeks. I worked to investigate it. I got a lot of credit, actually, Steve, for fixing this problem. You know, I met with the Secretary of Homeland Security. As a leader of the Committee on Homeland Security, I wrote a very stinging letter to the Attorney General to demand that they stop this, that it is too harsh of a penalty, that it is something that is too difficult for the families to endure. I have a 2-year-old and a 4-year-old, and it's something that, to me, it was heartbreaking. And so I stepped in and did something about it the more I learned about it. And I will tell you, Steve, when we first started talking about that 3 weeks before then, no one knew the extent of the issue. You didn't, Steve. The media didn't. We were all learning about what was going on.
And you were reacting.
And I was
as you went
asking
around.
the administration, what is going on here? And they were saying, look, because of the folks coming across violating our laws, this is the only option before this.
You know,
So when I learned about it, I stepped up and did something about it and actually fixed the problem. And I would say I've gotten a lot of credit. A lot of people have come up to me and said, look, I'm a moderate. I voted for Hillary Clinton or whatever, but I support you because of your leadership on that issue.
You know, one of your points for a while has been that a lot of folks back home here don't realize how much deception is going on at the border when it comes to adults with kids. They claim to be their own. They're not, in fact, their own kids. People saying I've been abused back home when they maybe haven't really been abused back home, all in an effort to get across the border legally. How big of a problem do we have in that realm?
Well, folks that are coming across the country, coming across the border, are being trafficked in. They're having to pay drug traffickers $7,000 or $8,000 a person. They are sometimes being sexually assaulted. They're being abused, and it's just a unsafe environment for the someone trying to migrate into the country. It's a profit for the cartels. Folks need to come to the ports of entry. If they have a lawful asylum claim, they need to come to the ports of entry and have that claim heard. We got to do it quicker. But using drug cartels to sneak across the border puts them at risk. It puts everybody at risk, and it makes more profit for these cartels that are, creating all the lawlessness and violence.
We have a phone call from Mary from Peculiar, Missouri, on the Missouri side, I guess. Mary, good morning.
Good morning.
Go ahead, Mary.
Okay, I'm interested in Kevin Yoder because he's federal. I want to know if they're going to try and secure Canadian borders as well, because as many drugs, from what I'm reading, are coming through Canada borders as they are Mexican borders.
Does there need to be more focus on the Canadian border, Congressman?
Well, look, anywhere we see crime and drug trafficking, human trafficking, we're stepping in to fill those gaps. The biggest issue that we have is the Rio Grande Valley sector. This is an area that comes from the Gulf of Mexico and goes west several hundred miles. That's where the majority of drug trafficking and the majority of human trafficking is occurring. That's our weak spot. And we have shown throughout the border, if we can add barriers, personnel, technology, we can put it there, we can actually solve that. But, to the extent that we have challenges at the northern border, we will focus on that as well.
Let's turn to health care in the few minutes we have left, Congressman. During the primary, Democrats hit you for voting for the GOP health care bill that could have cost as many as 81,000 of your constituents their health coverage. Why did you go there?
Well, our goal, Steve, is to preserve the American healthcare system. It's the greatest healthcare system in the world. It has the best innovation, access, quality of care. And Obamacare is not working the way that it was said to work. Premiums are still skyrocketing.
Well, arguably, your party hasn't helped a lot.
Well, I think our party could do a better job of it. But Obamacare itself needs to be fixed and improved. And we need to preserve the American healthcare system. And you contrast that, Steve, where the left is going now. My opponent supports a bill that abolishes private and employer-based insurance. That's very radical. Abolishing all private and employer-based insurance. That throws 178 million people, Steve, get their health care that way. It throws them off of their insurance,
Well,
and it makes them have to get their insurance through the government.
What's wrong with Medicare for All?
Well, that's not what it is, Steve, because Medicare for All, there are co-payments, there's Medicare Advantage. What my opponent supports is free health care for all, paid for with a $32 trillion tax increase, which has been estimated by even left-leaning associations to maybe almost triple our federal income taxes, leading to doctor shortages because you cut the rate down. The Medicare rate's 40% less than the private pay rate, so you cut that down. Their bill makes private hospitals illegal, so it expects that they will reduce the amount of hospitals we have in this country. So you have less doctors, less hospitals, a tripling of our federal taxes, less access to care, and all of it's mandatory. It's you abolish, Steve, walk the streets with me and see how many people believe that we ought to abolish all private and employer-based care and make it mandatory. And by the way, when you think about Medicare, Steve, seniors have spent their entire lives paying into this program. You're paying into it. I'm paying it now. Everyone who's working is paying into Medicare, and it's a specialized program for seniors. And what the folks like my opponent on the left want to do is they want to put everybody in that program, even people that haven't paid for it, even people that haven't paid a dime, maybe not even working. They want to give everyone free health care. It ruins the program for seniors, and they also want to hurt the veterans programs as well and wrap that into it. And so
we're getting
it's a very dangerous proposal, Stephen. It's way outside the mainstream, and it's radical. And I'd encourage people to examine its House Resolution 676 and what it would do to the American health care system. Would destroy it, triple our taxes, and take away 178 million people's private and employer-based care.
We're getting questions like this. Please ask Congressman Yoder if he knows how many of his constituents have pre-existing conditions and why he supports leaving them without health insurance. The GOP is suing to eliminate protections. The Senate bill doesn't guarantee coverage for pre-existing conditions.
I support guaranteeing coverage for people with pre-existing conditions.
No question.
No question.
Okay. We're about out of time. I want to thank you for coming in and sharing your time with us here today as you go about your tough race against the Democrat. And that's Kansas Congressman Kevin Yoder from the state's 3rd District. Thanks so much for coming in, Congressman.
Thanks for having me back on the show.
Sorry we couldn't get to all our phone calls today. Coming up, when we come back, we'll visit with our media critics about that anonymous New York Times op-ed last week